So hey there friends, and welcome to episode 267 of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. Today we are going to specifically talk about mindful movement as a tool and resource for both navigating and helping ourselves identify the beginning stages of overwhelm and overstimulation. I'm going to be talking about this particularly through the lens of being a highly sensitive person, but it applies to everyone, whether you are highly sensitive or not. So back in the last episode 266, we talked about overwhelm and overstimulation and why these are such big issues for highly sensitive people. And in that episode, I talked about upcoming episodes and how I was going to talk about some of my favorite tools for navigating that. And then I promptly disappeared for a couple of weeks. And that was not part of the plan, but life sometimes just doesn't quite go to plan. So life got really complicated there for a little while. And it has been a few weeks in between episodes, but we are picking up exactly where we left off. And I'm going to be talking about mindful movement. You can probably hear in my voice that I am a little croaky. I had the dreaded C word not too long ago, and it's just taking me the longest time to completely recover from that. So my voice is not super strong. So I apologize, if it's a bit crackly in your ears. But today I wanted to talk, as I said, about mindful movement as a tool. I get often asked about the type of movement that I teach, and I teach a very gentle form of movement. And often people will ask me if what I teach is exercise or fitness. And the answer is kind of not really. Some of what we do is definitely within the realm of exercise and fitness, and it can, be used to target particular mobility issues and things like that. But for the most part, I really don't think of what I do as belonging in that world. What I really think the type of movement that I teach is a tool for self-awareness and self-regulation. And the reason for that is that we can't regulate or change what we can't feel. And movement helps us feel. So movement that is distinct from exercise and fitness. That doesn't mean that those types of movements don't help us in similar ways. They absolutely can. But I think that the way that I teach movement and the type of movement that I teach, it really has kind of like learning how to feel at its heart. Often when I work with people one-on-one in more of a counseling kind of setup, they will come to me and they will say, I feel very disconnected between my brain and my body, or my mind and my body. They live very much kind of from the shoulders up. And whatever wisdom, whatever signaling their body is engaged in, they're kind of disconnected from that because they're living more in the thinking mind, living more in the worry and the thought processing. And I think that's incredibly common, and I've absolutely been there as well. The head can be a really noisy place, especially if you are a deep thinker, if you are the kind of person who is constantly forming connections between this thing and that thing. And so we can get stuck in like that analysis paralysis. We can get stuck in the allure of a very busy mind and forget that our body holds a whole lot of wisdom that often precedes the narratives that pop into our head. There's a saying or a quote from Deb Dana, which I've mentioned on this podcast before, but it is literally one of my favorite quotes of all time. And she says, the mind narrates what the nervous system knows, which really speaks to this idea that our nervous system and our body is responding to the world often before our mind can kind of catch up. And so our mind then makes a story about what the body and the nervous system is feeling. And so what if we can tap into the feeling state, not just the mental narrative that kind of comes after the fact? So I think that that's sort of some context around why our body is so important to pay attention to. And what we're going to dive into today is talking about, well, how is mindful movement this kind of perfect, wonderful playground in which to get better at doing that listening? So let's define mindful movement first, because, what is mindful movement? How is that different to just movement in general? So movement is any way that we move our body. Exercise generally has a very sort of clear purpose, right? We're doing it to increase our heart rate, or we're doing it to build strength, or we're doing it to make an impact on our cardiovascular system, something like that. Movement is any way that we move our body. It doesn't have to have any kind of goal associated with it. Nothing necessarily needs to be strengthened. Nothing necessarily needs to be stretched. Nothing necessarily needs to be, affected in any particular way. It is just simply moving the body. And mindfulness is where we're paying attention. And that doesn't always mean paying attention to just like the bits that are going the way that they're supposed to, but mindfulness really incorporates being aware of our whole person experience, our whole somatic experience. So it might include, and often does include, well, how am I thinking in the process of this movement? So mindful movement is where we're really paying attention to what we're feeling and even thinking in the act of moving our body. So yoga is a mindful movement practice, or can be a mindful movement practice. Pilates can be a mindful movement practice. Somatic exercise can be a mindful movement practice. So can walking, so can running, so can rock climbing. Lots and lots of different things can be a mindful movement practice, but it's just how we arrive to it that kind of determines whether that's the case or not. So one of the things, I guess, that defines mindful movement in the way that I'm thinking about it and talking about it here is that it's often slow. It doesn't have to be, but the slowness tends to be a deeper invitation into that internal noticing. Sometimes when we're moving really quickly, there just simply isn't time to pick up on the subtleties of what we feel. And so we hear the loud stuff, but not the quiet, subtle stuff. And so when we're mindfully moving in a slow, intentional way, it allows us to kind of get in touch with various volumes in what we're feeling, what we're sensing internally. And I think that that's really critical, because what can happen is if you're living in a body that feels constantly under stress and strain and tension and pain and discomfort, is it can actually start to feel like that is all that exists in your experience. I am just constantly feeling bad, right? And what we might come to notice through a mindful movement practice, or even a mindful moment with our body, that's not actually exactly true. There might be one small part of the body that doesn't actually feel that way. And there might be parts of the body where that volume of discomfort is quite high, but then other places where maybe it's the same kind of channel, right? Like the same idea is playing in that area, but the volume is much lower. And so a mindful movement practice lets us tap into that variability and that nuance, and helps us to see that what we might be thinking of as a very comprehensive, all-encompassing experience actually isn't. And that gives us a landing place, right? A bit of an anchor to something that is not just simply the discomfort. And that has a big impact on a kind of more holistic scale of being able to say, oh, it's amazing how more than one thing can be true at the same time. When we start to notice the varying volumes of sensation in our body, we start to notice that neutrality exists alongside discomfort, that pleasant sensations might exist alongside less pleasant sensations. And we start to notice that we are almost like an embodiment of the contradictory nature of the fact that two things can exist and be true at the same time that don't always seem to be the same. So that can be a really interesting thing. So what I wanted to share with you in this episode is a few questions that you can ask yourself, and a few, I guess, basic inquiries that we would include in a mindful movement practice that helps us to become better listeners. Because it's one thing to do the mindful movement practice and just go through the motions. It's quite another thing to use that practice as a place of inquiry. And I was thinking about this the other day, thinking about how for a very, very long time, my yoga practice in particular, because that's where I kind of entered the mindful movement world, my yoga practice was very much exclusively on the mat. You know, I would do my yoga practice on the yoga mat, and then that was kind of it. Once I wasn't in that place anymore, I was just living, you know, in the world, and the yoga practice was out of mind, out of sight, out of mind. We want to kind of use our movement practice to inform then how we can go and live our lives. The inquiry that we can be engaged in movement can then come with us off our mat. And I think that's where the real power lies. For a long time, I wanted to use my movement practice as a way of escaping, right? I wanted to use it as a way of tuning out. And the more age that I get under my belt, and I guess, you know, potentially the more wisdom, the more effective I believe it to be that we actually use our mindful practices, our mindful movement practices, and our movement practices as a way of going in, as a way of connection rather than disconnection. And sometimes that's uncomfortable, without a doubt, but I think that there is a lot more to be learned in that place that then helps us to be more kind custodians of, you know, this human experience, this human body that we're in. So let's just say that you are doing a yoga practice. We're going to use a really concrete example. You're on the yoga mat and you are moving through a very, a very familiar sequence to you. Maybe you're doing some cat-cows, maybe you're doing some downward dog, maybe you're exploring some breathing. And what can you do to make that a place of gentle, kind inquiry that helps you to become a more fluent speaker of the language of your body? And I'm going to link this to this Overwhelm piece shortly as well. So one of the things that you want to be asking is like, well, where do I feel effort? Where do I feel my body engaging in the effort to execute this pose? Now, you don't have to have anatomy language in order to do that, right? So it's not like you have to be able to say, well, it's my gastrocnemius that is contracting and my blah, blah, blah. Like, you do not have to do that. But you might be like, that's interesting. I can notice that my calf feels like it's doing some work here. Or not even that language, just allowing your attention to go to that place and like, I notice that I feel effort there, even if I don't have a word for it. And then the question becomes, where am I feeling or sensing that effort that feels particularly loud? Where does that effort or sensation feel at its loudest? And then if I allow myself to be curious, where perhaps is that effort a little quieter? Where perhaps is there an absence of effort? A sense of neutrality that is kind of the only way that I can then notice the effort in contrast to it. That's the kind of language that we can start to use to be able to notice, there's a difference in how things feel between effort and release, contraction and softening. And it's the contrast that allows us to notice, I can feel that thing happening. And it sounds so simple, but to just simply notice, I can feel that muscle or that group of muscles or this part of my body is currently under some sort of load. I can feel that they're having to work to make this thing happen. And the reason we want to be good at kind of noticing that is because when we are experiencing overwhelm, when we are overstimulated, those symptoms show up in our body first. They show up as contracted muscles, as increased heart rate. They show up as physical sensations. But if we aren't particularly adept at noticing when those things change, then we might not notice until we're having a full-blown moment of overwhelm. Whereas if we're a little bit more attuned to the subtle shifts and the subtle changes, then we can click into I think I'm starting to get overwhelmed much sooner in the piece, which gives us a clearer doorway to enter into to be able to go, I can do something to make this change. Because once we are in the deep throes of overwhelm and overstimulation, it's much more challenging to regulate from there. But when we're kind of on the edge, we tend to have a little bit more of our resources available to us, and so we can have a bigger impact. So that's why this is important. And maybe I should have led with that, but we got there. And then the other thing that I want to invite you to do is to use fairly intentionally neutral language when it comes to noticing how you feel. So one of the ways that we might normally notice effort or discomfort in the body would be to be like, oh, my stupid, dodgy right hip is hurting like it always does. So that might be like the internal noticing that we engage in. Oh, that stupid hip, it's always sore. My dodgy hip, my bad back, my screwed up left ankle. We have this way of often talking to ourselves and about our body. So my invitation would be, as you notice this stuff, as you are engaged in a mindful movement practice, to add in language that is intentionally more neutral. And the way that I like to do this is to insert, I'm noticing that before the thing that you're noticing. So, I'm noticing that I'm experiencing some discomfort in my right hip. So it doesn't mean pretending that it's okay, right? Like that dodgy, screwy right hip doesn't suddenly become, it's all rainbows and rivers inside my right hip. No, we're still being true. We're still telling the truth about what we're experiencing, but we're creating just a little bit of neutrality and a little bit of distance for ourselves so that we're not going into that kind of combative mode with ourselves. So, I'm noticing that there's some discomfort in my right hip is a very different dialogue to, oh God, my stupid right hip is just hurting again, like it always does. Very different. And so when we use that language of I'm noticing that, we create a little bit of space where it's not about blame. It's not about judgment. It's not about all the ways that we don't measure up. It's a simple act of noticing. And my experience is that when we can do that, it gives us more space to respond in a way that is kind of steeped in curiosity rather than judgment. And that is really, really important. Because once we have sort of honed this skill to listen, like I said, overwhelm and overstimulation, they happen in the body. You will notice something happening in your skin, in your body, in your musculature, in your, felt state that is a subtle little sign that says, you are heading in this direction, right? You are heading towards overwhelm. You are heading towards overstimulation. And it might be something really simple like, I'm just noticing that I'm clenching my teeth. Or, I can really notice an ache in my shoulders. What might be going on? Or, I know that when I start gripping into my belly, that is one of the first signs that I receive that I am dipping a toe into overwhelm. Because when we can do that, then we have a greater capacity to respond. When we aren't quite there yet, then the inevitable happens and we miss the first sign, we miss the second sign, we miss the third sign, and then suddenly we're in this full-blown state of overwhelm, even panic, or, whatever other word feels like it fits in your experience. We're in that. And then once we're in that, it's a little bit harder to ground out of it. It's not impossible, but it becomes more tricky. Just simply because our physiology has taken over. So that's the beauty of a mindful movement practice, is it simply allows us to get better at noticing subtle stuff that's happening inside our body. And what you might notice when you start is like, there's a lot more going on than I ever gave my body credit for. But what might become apparent is that what you've been tuned into is just the loudest stuff. And to be fair, the loudest stuff is really asking for your attention. So it's not about turning it off, but noticing that there is varying volumes of information coming from your body. And if you can start to see the way that your body communicates with you through sensation as a gift, as a narrative, as a invitation into conversation with it, it changes a lot, because suddenly that dodgy right hip isn't just there to piss you off. It's there to give you information. It's there to get your attention for a really good reason. And so It can really change the way that we meet ourselves in general. But then when it comes to overwhelm, we might be more able to pick up on the early subtle signs that we are starting to feel overwhelmed. And I want to give you a couple of examples in case that's not quite landing yet. One of them might be that you notice what it feels like to be holding your breath. And so when you're engaged in a mindful movement practice, it will often include some kind of breath focus potentially. And so you might notice, I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out, I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out. And then at some point you're like, oh my gosh, I've been holding my breath. Breathing in, I'm breathing out, I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out. And that might be one of your first signs that you are moving into something kind of stressful, right? You might notice, oh, I've been holding my breath. And that isn't always something that you will notice if you're not used to putting your attention on your breath. Because at some point your body will start to breathe again, right? Because it has to. That's part of the absolute necessity of being alive. So it will find a way to do that again. But you might suddenly be like, oh, I noticed that I was holding my breath. What's going on? Another example is when I was teaching more in person, one of the things that you would see people do all the time would be just to release their shoulders from their ears. And they could have been halfway through quite a mindful, relaxing class and still find their shoulders creeping up towards their ears. And so there'd always be these gentle reminders, let your ears soften, your shoulders soften away from your ears. And then people would come back to class, the next week. Maybe it was their first week. They come back the next week and they'd be like, gosh, I had no idea how often my shoulders were up around my ears. But just simply through the process of noticing that in a class, suddenly they were able to pick up on that information in their daily lives. And it's not that they just started doing it more often, but it's that we use the power of our attention to say, oh, look at what's happening here. And suddenly they were more able to pick up on that information outside of their practice in their everyday lives. And the way that our body responds to the early stages of overwhelm and overstimulation is to go into some sort of protective mode, right? So when our shoulders go up towards our ears, we're in protection mode. We're in the mode of there might be something here that I need to respond to. So we feel all of those systems that allow us to fight or flee or do whatever we need to do start to come online. And that might be subtle at first because overwhelm tends to be a cumulative thing. It's not like, a massive loud bang and everything's online. It's like this slow accumulation of this thing, then that thing, then this thing, then that thing, and all of a sudden you are overloaded. And so we might start to just sense those early subtle signs of I might need to pay attention. And we absolutely get better at noticing those things when we notice them on purpose within a container of something like a mindful movement practice. Because when we're in that practice, there's really nowhere else for us to be. There's nowhere else that our attention needs to go. And so we can practice the skill as well of bringing our attention back to our body when it wanders off, because it will, and that's fine. So it's like this very powerful playground to notice how we can control our attention, how we can pick up on the subtle and not so subtle signals coming from our body. And then it also helps us to start to learn the tools that we can respond with, which is the thing that I think is particularly cool about a mindful movement practice. It's like we're learning how to speak another language, even though I think it's a language we all know. We just have to kind of reacquaint ourselves with it. But we're learning how to speak that language. And at the same time, almost like practicing the art of being in conversation at the same time. I recently started doing Duolingo for the first time. I'm a bit late to that particular party, but I have recently started and I'm slightly obsessed. That tends to be my way. I go all in or not in at all. So I'm all in on Duolingo at the moment. And, one of the things that obviously I can't do is talk to somebody else currently because nobody else is learning the language that I'm learning, which is French. And in this analogy, where we're learning to listen to our body and learning to speak our body's language, it's like I'm learning the language and I'm also in the cafe ordering a coffee at the same time. I'm learning how to use those tools in real time in this controlled environment that then I can take out into the real world and use. So it's like this beautiful place where we get to learn and put into practice all at the same time, which is very, very cool. Okay, I think that is what I wanted to talk about this week. It's really great to be back. Thank you for your patience in waiting for this episode to drop. I imagine you weren't, waiting too anxiously for it, but hopefully it comes at a great time. I hope that was really helpful. I will be back next week, and we are going to be talking about one of my other favorite tools, which it certainly won't be the first time we've spoken about this on the podcast, and nor will it be the last, because it's a topic that I could talk about for years and years, I'm sure, and never get tired of it. So we're going to talk about self-compassion and kindness in the context of this overstimulation and overwhelm, and how we can use that as a tool to help navigate when we find ourselves in those states. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. In the meantime, if you have any questions, you know that you can come and connect with me. I would love to hear from you. You'll find me over on Instagram at ericawebb_selfkind. You can also visit my website, ericawebb.com.au. And I did also want to mention, it's been a really long time since I have mentioned the SelfKind Hub here, but we're about to enter term 3. And inside the SelfKind Hub, we have live classes as well as a huge library of pre-recorded classes. And this is what we do in them. We learn how to speak the language of our body. We learn how to be in a state of communication with our body that is kind and compassionate and loving and really responsive to our body's needs. And so you can join that at any time, but at the moment we are about to dive into term 3. We have a live stream class every single Wednesday morning, and we also meet live once every month on a Sunday. And then all of the recordings, as well as pre-recorded shorter sessions, go into a huge massive library that you have access to all the time. So I really encourage you to check that resource out if you're not already in there with me and the community. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource. If the kind of stuff that we've been talking about here is something that you think, I think I need more of that, come and check out the SelfKind Hub. It's exactly what we do over there, and I would love to support you. So you'll find more information for that at ericawebb.com.au/SelfKind Hub, but I will make sure that I pop all the links in the show notes as well. Okay, friends, again, so lovely to be back. I will look forward to chatting with you next week, and until then, keep being kind to yourselves.